Afternoon and welcome to this policy event. We are live from Khana House from Tehran, Iran. I am Amir Shahraini, your host and moderator for this session. Just to give a brief introduction of myself first, I'm the Director of International Affairs at the Sharif Policy Research Institute, which is affiliated with the Sharif University of Technology, the top-ranked university in Iran. I also got an MPA, Master of Public Administration in the field of organizational development from the University of Tehran. This event is organized by the Sharif Policy Research Institute in association with Khana House. Khana House is the home for Iranian think tanks and policy research institutions, providing the infrastructure, services, and support to improve Iran's policy ecosystem and amplify its voice in the global conversations. So today's discussion is titled Iran's Post-War Economic Reconstruction with focus on lessons from China's industrial development experience. As many of you are aware, Iran is currently navigating an extraordinary challenging period, and questions around how the country rebuilds both economically and institutionally are becoming increasingly urgent. So let me tell you a background on the conflict that we are living in right now. The current war began on February 28th when the US and Israel killed the late Supreme Leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and launched a 2 month large scale war against Iran. However, a ceasefire was announced in early April. And then the US and Iran signed a 14-point memorandum of understanding in mid-June, which ended the fighting and lifted the US naval blockade and also reopened the Strait of Hormuz. However, the MOU has since unraveled. By July 8th, just a few days ago, as you guys have noticed, the United States has declared that the ceasefire is over, and the US carried out the strikes against Iran, just as happening right now. And Iran, however, responded by attacking the US bases in the region. On the diplomatic side, the Pakistan and Qatar are reportedly still working to bring US and Iran back to the negotiation table. While the shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, which had been recovering during the ceasefire, has dropped once again sharply amid the new strikes. This is obviously a fast-moving and sensitive situation, and while our focus today is on the economic and industrial dimensions of this reconstruction phase, but the context is very important and relevant for understanding the urgency of the road ahead. So today we've brought together an esteemed board of panelists to explore the ongoing situations and to uh, explore how the lessons of post-war recovery and industrial development in the world might inform Iran's path forward. In particular, we will be looking closely at the China's experience and asking what is transferable to Iran's unique context. Over the next 90 minutes, we will be moved through several key areas. First, briefly touching on the current state of war and prospects for de-escalation and scenarios ahead, and then turning to the economic and reconstructional priorities of Iran and how reconstruction can be leveraged not only just to rebuild, but to drive long-term industrial transformation. We will be taking a look at the specific lessons from the Chinese experience, the role of industrial policy, and finally, we will be talking about the institutional and governance capacities needed to make reconstruction succeed. By delving into the key topics of this panel, we hope to provide a comprehensive overview of the current landscape and the future possibilities. So let me tell you guys, to the audience, that if you have any question during this session, just feel free to write them down in the chat box. We're going to read them all and select a few to ask them from our panelists at the end of the session in the Q&A part. You can also raise hand to ask questions directly. The session features leading voices from academia, policy, and industry, which offers a comprehensive perspective on the current state of war and the strategies of post-war reconstruction. So today we're honored to have these four outstanding commentators as our panelists for this event. Lucy Wu, who is the founder of Star Moon Era Buyer, joining us live from Dubai, UAE. Michael Hilliard, Director of Defense and Security Analysis at the Axis Society for Central Asian Affairs, joining us live from Australia. Harald Bushman, independent analyst for CCG and the Investment Association of China, and a senior researcher at Intellegia Institute, who is joining us live from China. And Jeff Schubert, who was a professor of international business at the Irkutsk National University, joining us live from Cambodia. I would like to welcome you all and thank you so much for joining us here today uh, for this panel discussion during these tough times. Welcome, you guys. And I would like to leave the full introduction to our panelists. If possible, I would like to ask you guys to introduce yourselves. So let me start with you, Lucy, if you can hear me. Could you please go ahead, introduce yourself, and just briefly give us an introduction to the whole topic? Go ahead, please.
Um, Hi, hello everyone. Here's Lucy from Dubai. So thank you so much for Mr. Amil for inviting me to join this seminar. I know you have done a lot of efforts to make it, and also thank you for the other person here, like for joining and making it happen. So my name is Lucy. I am native Chinese. I'm now 26 years old. And I was a founder for Starmu Everywhere. This is a business media platform to bridge China and Middle Eastern business. So before that, I was a former member and the consultant for Saudi Chinese Business Council. So I have been living in Middle East for 3 years, and before that, also joined for several different TV stations and some newspapers to do the interview for the China and Middle Eastern business relationships, especially. So today we are mainly talking about. I would be very cautious about making military predictions, but now we were trying to make it to create to discuss the development opportunity for Iran as for the reconstruction things. So honestly, from the perspective of someone who lives and works in the region, I see this conflict as more than a military confrontation. It has become a three-leg crisis, is a security crisis, an economic crisis, and a crisis of confidence. So I do not see this war as creating develop directly as some development opportunities, because war is first and foremost a human tragedy, right? So I sincerely hope that we can gain peace like as soon as possible. But if there is to be a pace forward, it must be move from escalation to diplomacy, from emergency relief to institutional recovery, and from simply repairing damage to building a more resilient economy. And thank you so much, ma'am.
I think you're muted. I think you're muted. Amir, I think you're muted.
Yeah, we cannot hear you.
Hey, Amir, we cannot hear.
Now you can hear me?
Yes.
I'm sorry. So Michael, if you can hear me, please go ahead. It's your turn. Please introduce yourself first and give us your vision on the topic. Please go ahead.
No problem at all. Again, thank you for having me. My name is Michael. I am the Director of Defense and Security Analysis at the Oxford Society for Central Asian Affairs. I was a war correspondent for many years, and then I became a defense analyst, mostly focusing on the Middle East and the former Soviet countries, and then specializing in former Soviet, now doing a lot of time in Central Asia. I spent quite a lot of time looking at Iran's military and security services, as well as their economy, and done quite a lot of work on the Chinese economy over the years as well. Obviously, the war is an absolute tragedy, and there's a lot of terrible things to come out of it, but I think there is a lot of interesting opportunities that could be had coming out of the war. Iran has a huge amount of positive catalysts that could be very, very utilized going forward out of this, but it depends on what decisions are made and what the post-war government looks like, even though I think it's pretty hard to predict what post-war could be right at the moment. But I'll leave that for later on. I'll hand over to the rest of my panelists.
Thank you so much, Michael. I appreciate it. So Harald, if you can hear me, please go ahead. Introduce yourself and tell us your vision on the whole topic.
Yes, thank you, Amir, for having me. And I'm sorry for my voice. I've just had a cold, so if I sound weird, it's because yeah, I'm just recovering. So my name's Harold. I'm originally Swiss, and I've been living in China for almost 20 years. I'm fluent in the language, also in reading and writing. So I'm mostly um, here to talk about the Chinese experience. Obviously, China has an extremely fast recovery after a very long period of war and downfall from the 1850s to the 1950s, almost 100 years. And I'm going to be talking a bit about this. Regarding the regarding the Iran situation right now, I don't want to claim to be an expert, but I'm afraid I wasn't surprised that new attacks were coming. The US is not in a situation where they are a reliable partner to negotiate. So I'm afraid there need to be very hard guarantees before there can be a real peace. And I don't think that contracts are a reliable thing, because Iran has had several contracts and they were always broken from the US side, and they will be broken again. That doesn't mean that there's no hope. I think there is hope, and I hope we can explore this, and the reconstruction can happen and must happen even while the fighting is still ongoing.
Thank you so much, Harold. I appreciate it. And Jeff, if you can hear me, please go ahead, introduce yourself, and just briefly give us your introduction to the topic.
Well, many years ago,
I'm sorry, can you please open your webcam so we can see you?
I thought it was open. Hang on a sec. It's open.
I feel like you should accept my request so you can open your webcam.
Hang on, I thought I was open. I get an error.
Oh, so okay, we can have your insights and we'll try later. Go ahead, please.
Okay. No, I'm a former chief economist of an Australian bank, but also Australia is a resource-rich country like Australia, resource cursed, so they say. I spent many years in Russia, quite a bit of time in Central Asia, looking at resource rich or resource cursed countries. I've also worked in China for a couple of years in Shanghai. And as an international business professor, I've taught many, many Chinese students. I have never been to Iran, not pretending to be an expert, and certainly will not be looking at China to the degree that Harold has. And I'll leave it up to Michael to talk about Iran's strategic position.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I appreciate it. So before discussing the reconstruction, it is important to understand where the conflict stands today. So, like how the regional and international actors are responding, and what conditions could shape a transition towards a post-war phase. You know, the war is not finished yet, and even right now, the strikes are happening against Iran. So, as an intro to our panel, we would like to discuss the current state of the conflict and the path forward. So, I would like to raise this question from you, Lucy. If you can hear me, please let us know, what is the current state of conflict in your point of view, and what are the key factors that shaping its paths right now?
Hi, hello. I'm sorry, but can you repeat the question again? I think there's
The
something
question is
wrong with
about,
my.
sure. The question is
Uh-huh.
about the current state of war in your perspective, and the key factors right now that's shaping its path.
Okay, thank you so much. I will open my camera also. Hi. Yeah, so honestly, I would say that first, we know now the security situation is very fragile. So even while there are a lot of efforts to de-escalate the risk that, like a local incident, a miscalculation or an attack on civilian or energy infrastructure can quickly pull more actors into the conflicts. So just this morning, I heard from my Chinese friends who based in Saudi. So they reported that they heard several there is attack also in Abu Ha airport, which makes my Chinese friends also very anxious, especially. So you can imagine the businessmen that are working in Saudi, working in Middle East, like me in Dubai also. I found like not that determined about the whole situation. So I mean, the real issue is not only whether like fighting pauses, it is whether there is a credible like political mechanism into to prevent the next escalation. And also we can clearly figure out the economic damage is already wider than the battlefield.
Yeah.
So in this region, like energy infrastructure, shipping roads, insurance courses, ports, logistics, communications, and supply chains. All these things are all connected. So for business, uncertainty itself is like a form of damage. So a manufacturer may delay investment, a shipping company may reroute, a small importer may lose access to working capital. These effects are often less visible than physical destruction, but they can last longer. So as a person who working in CBC before, so just like this year in 2026, we have witnessed a huge decrease of the delegation who coming in Saudi also. So this is very important to discuss today. Like reconstruction cannot just wait until the last day of conflict. So resilience has to begin now. Like not only about protecting the infrastructure, supporting small business and households to. And preparing transparent mechanism to recover. So that is my thinking. I hope that for Iran, like peace and predictability can always be like obtained naturally and constantly. They are like economic. The peace already. They are economic infrastructure, I would say. So I definitely wish that the whole region can can come better right now. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for the comments. So I'd like to ask the same question from you, Jeff. How do you see the current state of war? And what are those key factors and key developments that shaping its trajectory to the end?
As I've already said, I'm certainly not an expert on Iran or regional issues. So I think I will pass this issue on to somebody like Michael.
Oh, it's okay. Okay, so Michael, how do you see the current state of war? And what are those key factors that affecting its trajectory to the end? Can we like see an end for this war right now? Please go ahead.
Perfect. So I'll just share my screen. I have a face that's good enough for screen. The war is still in a very delicate and odd place at the moment. I just over the last 24 hours, as of this afternoon, I pulled the strikes that have happened in Iran over the last 24 hours. You can see there's been quite a few that happened overnight last night. The war is in a precarious spot, and a spot that is unfortunately getting worse. From the American side, Trump is very, very keen to try and get this all resolved before the midterm elections. And there's also increasing pressure on the United States, who are seen by most of the world as being the ones to launch this campaign. Because frankly, whilst a lot of Western nations haven't felt as much pressure from this conflict, particularly your developing world and a lot of Southeast Asia are already rationing fuel, oil, and particularly when it comes to fertilizer. We've already seen, let's say, first crops going in places, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, that would have not got fertilizer because the fertilizer is stuck on the other end of the Strait of Hormuz. So this is a conflict that is causing problems in other secondary and third theaters. Where the conflict's stuck at the moment is, I think, as much as Trump would like to bring it to some sort of conclusion, Iran does not want to just walk away from this for no reason at all. It has to walk away with some sort of security guarantee to reassure both its citizenry as well as investors that, hey, this isn't just going to start back up either after the midterms or just in 3 or 4 years' time when things eventually, kind of come to loggerheads again. So it's a position that, frankly, is getting worse for the US, and the Iranians have probably got the political capital to hold on for a lot longer. So there's a phrase that we used to hear all the time in Afghanistan, which was, that the Americans have the watches, but the Afghans have the time. And I think that's a pretty apt saying for what's going on in this particular conflict. Where it goes from here, I think the Americans can bomb and bomb and bomb, but it won't actually change the strategic position on the ground, and will only elicit, more attacks on Gulf infrastructure from the Iranians in retaliation.
Yes.
Either this escalates to pretty catastrophic positions, or we end up just dragging this out in a result that needs to be done.
Yes, thank you so much. So let me bring my video back. Okay, so Harold, if you can hear me, how do you see the current state of the war? And let me ask you this question: that how different the stakeholders, regional, international, and especially China, approach the prospects of de-escalation? Like, what role China is playing right now?
Right. So I think Michael just gave an excellent overview of the difficulty to end the war. I would add Israel, of course. There's this view that Israel simply will not let the US end this war, will not let the US walk away with a peace deal or a surrender deal, because they view Israel as an existential threat. And so they want to use the entirety of the US military to fight against Iran. I cannot say how accurate this is, but it sounds to me like threateningly accurate. And I really hope that everyone here in this panel and everyone in Iran is safe and in a safe place, and hopefully not civilian casualties will happen. Now, regarding the Chinese experience, I want to maybe here quote from a period where China also faced a militarily very much superior enemy that had the bigger weapons, came from outside and attacked China. That was during World War II, when the Japanese invaded China. And one of the leaders, Mao Zedong, the leader of the communist faction fighting against the Japanese, said, early on, he said, this is not going to be a short war. This will be a protracted war. We're not able to defeat the enemy right away. So we need 3 things that happen to win the war. And I think this is maybe still interesting. He said, we need the united front at home, meaning end all internal fights between different factions, nationalists, communists, etc., to have a united front and really stand together to fight this enemy. Then we need the international united front, meaning we need the international community to stand clear in this conflict. And then we need a revolution inside the enemy camp. And I think on all 3 points, Iran has made significant progress already in this year. Internally, I don't know. I don't want to comment on Iran internal affairs, but internationally, certainly, I think of the Lego videos, but also in China, just the way Iran has been able to withstand these really strong attacks and even fight back in a very strong way. This has surprised a lot of Chinese that I know of, who expected more a scenario maybe like Syria. And they were surprised positively how strong Iran stands. So in terms of international front, there's this aspect. And in terms of revolution, not that the US is going to fall into a full revolution and change its government, but at least within NATO, there is now a growing opposition in the European side to supporting these attacks in this war. Also for the reasons Michael laid out, because the economic cost is just really growing very fast. I'm honestly not very optimistic on the term of de-escalation because, again, as I've mentioned, there are strong forces that do not want to have de-escalated. So unless the economic pressure is so high that the US and Europe are forced to stop the aggression, I think it's difficult to come to like a negotiated kind of calming down of the situation, because it's not an emotional fight. It's not a fight that is based on a one against one. It's a very complex situation, and I don't think Israel and the parts of the US that are loyal to Israel will let this fight go.
Thank you so much for your comprehensive overview. I appreciate it. So, Jeff, if you can hear me, we can have your presentation, but I feel like you have to share your screen before that.
Okay, so I'm putting the video on, putting it on, and I'm trying to share. How do I share?
There is a button right in the upper section,
Which
which
one?
like beside the webcam button. You can
Yeah.
push the button to share your screen.
Okay. Share. Share.
We can't see anything right now. And also, while you're sharing your screen, I would like to welcome Dr. Mohsen Abdullahzadeh. Feel like is a colleague of yours, Jeff. I've just learned that he's in their panel. So
Yeah,
welcome,
Wilson is
Dr.
there. Yeah. I don't know why I can't share. I did it before. It worked before. I said it to you. Can you put
You
it
might
up?
have,
Okay,
yeah,
just
otherwise,
sure. Michael, would you like to go
I was,
ahead since Jeff is preparing his uh, presentation? Could you please go
And
ahead
now
and
oh,
I sent it to you earlier, so
yes,
you can probably load it up, but I
yes.
can't for some reason.
So while I'm loading your presentation, I would like Michael to go ahead, and after Michael, we can have your presentation, Jeff. I'm
Okay, fine.
preparing your stuff. Okay,
Thank you. Thank you.
thank you.
if you get, all I was going to say was, Jeff, you quite often with a website like this, if you've got your camera open on another app, it won't let you open it on this one as well. You can't
No,
have two
no, it's
cameras
not.
open.
I've been on another. It's not. It's not.
No. Anyway, so whilst he gets that going, I can kind of talk a little bit about what
Thank
we're seeing at the moment. Let me share my screen then. I'll just quickly entire screen. Perfect. So I guess the big questions we have coming up are what a post-government or post-war government is going to actually look like at this point.
Yes.
Unfortunately, that's still very much up in the air at the moment. Whether this ends up in a deal like that Trump put on the table, a few weeks ago now, or whether it ends up in Trump, as some fear in the defense community that it goes to a catastrophic option after the midterms. It's still all up in the air, and I do hope we can find some sort of better solution. The immediate thing that will need to be figured out is how to get effectively back to even where we were at the beginning of the conflict, but we need to somehow find a way past that point and improve the situation. If you look at the GDP graph here, 2025 was already a year where the Iranian economy was taking a bit of a dive, and that's not a good place to be. And a lot of the thing that was still driving the economy into 2024 was the fact that the Iranians were still able to put out massive amounts of oil, and the oil price was relatively high. The other thing I would point out is that even if there's president of the Iranians or every side can actually come out and say, look, we're ready to go, the strait's open, there still needs to be the confidence from the investment community, and particularly the insurance community, this is actually the truth. I just pulled this up live. This is effectively the live shipping map out of the Strait of Hormuz, and there's still ships that are not going through unless they get complete guarantees from both sides. And that just ups the price dramatically on anything coming in and out. And even when we have seen ships leave, there are not ships coming back in. So there's still going to be a lot of work and trust that needs to be gained on both sides before we can get anywhere near a peace deal on this one. Just again, chat up whenever you're ready to go, and I'll wrap it up there. Perfect. If you look at sort of what would need to be immediately looked at, just fixing some of the basics, like getting power, water, and some productive industries going. So, for instance, getting some of the steel works that have been hit would be particularly important. Getting rail lines up, back and running, getting communication, getting payment infrastructure going as well. Having spent time in Iran over the years, one of the difficulties I always have is getting sort of payments or connecting Iranian banks to my banks. I have to funnel it through other stuff, and it's a whole nightmare. And that makes it really difficult for someone trying to do business. But again, Iran has the capability to do good business. If we look back to, let's say, the JCPOA period, where the sanctions came off and Iran was opened up to a lot of the world, Iran took the opportunity and did really well with it. They became a really good manufacturing hub for the European Union, and you have a huge amount of bonuses that you can offer the community out here. A very educated population, a pretty stable, low cost of power, pretty stable economic pool. I mean, this is a built-in domestic market as well. This is all really, really positive stuff you'd like to see. The trouble is that having seen Iran, for all intents and purposes, effectively stick to the terms of the JCPOA, and then having the deal ripped up afterwards, that will always leave a nervousness in investors, and it just puts a risk premium on that other states won't have. And this is going to be a really difficult one that Iran needs to find a way to come out of this position, and come out of the position strong enough that investors at least will look at Iran as too strong to mess with in the same way that the Americans and the Israelis have in this particular run. So it's a really difficult hill to sort of climb over. And the question now is what government is going to be making the decisions to climb that hill. But I assume you've probably got everything up and running now. So do you want me to hand back to you or keep going?
Could you please keep on going?
Yeah, no, fine. Take all good.
Yes.
So if we look at, let's say, some of the low-hanging fruit, so we need to get employment sorted. And if we look at, we're talking about Chinese models here. I think, whilst the Chinese models do offer some lessons that we can take from this, I think it's not a template. China is a far more centralized government than Iran is at the moment. It doesn't have the patchwork of ethnicities as in the same degree that Iran does. And that makes things a little more difficult for how Iran needs to bind this together. It'll also be really interesting to see what comes out of this government, and whether it's an IRGC-driven government or closer to the more conventional governments we've seen in the past. Where the money goes in the very first projects that we see coming out of construction will also tell us a huge amount about where the head of the government is going. If it's going back into building statues or leisure facilities, that tells us one thing. But if it's going into productive construction, that's a whole other thing. One of the ways that China came out of particularly earthquakes or the major financial recessions it did really well was building productive infrastructure. If we look at, let's say, this is a rail map of Iran as it stands at the moment. The Central Asians have for many years been begging Iran, for a way to get out to the Indian Ocean, and currently they're stuck because they've got Afghanistan, which is a bit of a too risky place to sort of guarantee long-term infrastructure. And you've got Iran, which has been under secondary sanctions threat. If Iran was to, let's say, take these early construction hits and start to build down from places like Iran Shah down to Chabahar, that's something that could make money back, and it's an asset that you put $1 in and you get more money back. That'll be, that and rebuilding some key infrastructure like fixing Karg, fixing the steel works that have been bombed, fixing some of the, power and infrastructure stuff that comes into the country. That's really key to the kind of really early stages of what we're talking about here. If we don't see that, it's going to be very difficult to get any FDI growth, and there hasn't been good FDI growth in the country for quite a while now. So, yeah, investor and citizen confidence. Again, we talk about we need to do all this stuff to keep the investors happy, but we also need to keep the Iranian citizenship, happy, and effectively make sure they're confident with their government as well. And this, again, there's a lot of leeway being given to the current government, or particularly the IRGC as well, because of the fact that the Iranian population is at war at the moment. But once the war ends, there will be a lot of demands on that government, and we saw large up protests prior to this. Will this government effectively be able to right the ship before those protests kick back off, before these demands come back in and the grace period disappears? And what will the institutional reforms bring? Again, like I was talking about Central Asia, there are lots of these small wins that even if Iran can walk out of this, is one of the big things they really want is a sanctions relief. And that would be huge. That right now they have all the bonuses to be able to effectively take in materials, goods, minerals, everything from Central Asia and pump it into either the Indian Ocean or the Iraqi markets or out to sort of Baluchistan area. That would be great. Investors would love to see that. And it's a much safer and more reasonable option to go through Iran than Afghanistan in most cases. But that would require effectively all sanctions being taken off. Now, the fact that the Trump administration has already been willing to float that is a really good sign that they will walk away from this. But I still think, again, it comes down to that investor confidence problem. There's a term, having done, it's almost a rite of passage when you live in Australia, that you have to learn about mining economics and whatnot. And I think there's anyone who's done mining in, developing world countries, there's always kind of a metric of shovels to tractors. I'm a gold mine. I think it's a long term, and I think it's really good. I can get more efficiency and better gold, and the whole thing's better if I buy a tractor, but it might take me a few years to pay off. In a country like Australia, people feel really confident doing that because contract law exists. The government generally is pretty reasonable. Everything, if you write a contract, it will generally be that way going forward. On the other hand, if you go the opposite way in your Sierra Leone or Liberia or the Democratic Republic of Congo, they aren't willing to put that money up front. So they end up giving them shovels because, if the investment goes bad and everything's nationalized or a mine is overrun or the place falls into a civil conflict, well, then, you've only lost a small amount of money because of the shovels. Iran needs to find a way to prove that it is tractor-worthy and shovel-worthy. Part of that issue has been, some of it has been institutional. A lot of it has been imposed on Iran by the United States and Israel, and that's a problem as well. A big marketing pitch or big sort of problem the Iranians need to figure out is how they can prove that they are a long-term investment rather than a short-term, we're just here for the cheap resources and the domestic labor pool. Do you want me to keep going or are you good going?
Thank you so much, Michael. I appreciate your remarks.
No,
thank you so much. So, okay, let me bring back my webcam. So, Harald, if you can hear me, I would appreciate it. So we can have your presentation. And Jeff, please send your files to me on LinkedIn or anywhere because I cannot open the link to your website.
No.
Okay, Harald, please.
I already sent my PowerPoint presentation to you today.
Yes.
Can you see it, the presentation?
Yes.
Yes, it's
okay.
It's okay. Please go ahead.
So I just want to share some insights from the Chinese experience of the downfall and the reemergence. And I want to be quick so we don't use too much time on presentations. So first, why do we look at China? I think everybody knows this. There's on the right side here, you see the GDP per capita of China that just goes through the roof in the last 20 years. Before that, China was in the level of Nigeria, India, or Honduras, really among the poorest countries in the world. And on the left side, there's the poverty rate, how many percent of the population lived with less than $4.2 a day. And it just dropped from about 90% in the 1980s to zero, basically. And I want to emphasize one point, Michael has already alluded to this one, which is development cannot be seen only as economic growth. I think that's very important. And for that, we can look here at the life expectancy. China reached life expectancy of 60 years already in 1974, 20 years before India. And also when China had a per capita GDP, the average income was just $160 per year, whereas India needed to get to 347, more than double the GDP per capita until they could reach 60-year life expectancy. And what that tells us is that a government should not overemphasize GDP numbers at first, but rather look at the livelihood of the people to ensure that those industries like food, shelter, care, these things are covered, and as much as possible through your own means rather than relying on external help. So China's downfall, I've already mentioned this a little bit. When there's internal revolution and rebellion, then it's hard to defend the country. And that's really the story of China. The Opium Wars start in the 19th century, the French War, Japanese invasion, and that's kind of summarized as the century of humiliation when foreign powers invaded China and one after another took part of the territory. And we can see at that time, in parallel, the Chinese government was actually very busy fighting rebellions. The Taiping Rebellion had like 40, 50 million dead. It was the biggest rebellion in human history. And a lot of similar other parallel rebellions. And it's very important to keep that in mind, that it's not just the foreign powers, but really also the internal situation that prevented China from modernizing. I think that's the main point. It didn't just grow weaker. it was the time when Europe saw an incredible rise in productivity through the industrialization. And China tried to modernize. They bought foreign weapons, they bought foreign warships, the modern fleet, but they failed to build the factories and really internalize this technology. And that's the main message here. Buying external things is good, FDI is good, but really you need to import the technology skills, the know-how, otherwise it's really just short-term measures. Then a second very important phase after the World War II, the communists were almost defeated by the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek in 1947, and the West expected the communists to be fully defeated in a short time. And just 2 years later, communists announced the People's Republic of China, the foundation. They have conquered basically all of the north, the central parts, and down to the south. Only in the west, southwest, Tibet, Sichuan, these regions are still not fully liberated, as the communists would say at the time. And the way how they won this incredible victory is very important, because Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader, had this very clear idea that he needs to defeat the internal enemies. He needs to defeat the communists before he can rebuild. Whereas the communist method, the Mao Zedong method, was bian da bian dian, meaning you both fight and you build. So while you are fighting the enemy, whatever territory they conquer, they immediately start doing land reform. They immediately give women power and women's rights. They immediately do changes. So the population welcomes them as liberators rather than seeing them as an invader. And this method gave them popular support. And this popular support, Michael has already mentioned that, is very important to always keep in mind that the citizens need to be supportive of where the country is going. And after they won, China was completely collapsed. I don't need to go into that. I'm just saying this is in a way worse situation than Iran is now. Obviously, people were illiterate, people were extremely poor and hungry, really worse than Iran. So Iran has also some positive hope. It doesn't need to take 80 years to rebuild as China took. But what's here important is right after they came to power, the communists started to really, really move fast. Within a year, they had a marriage law that for the first time in Chinese history gave women the right to decline a wedding that the parents had decided. It gave women the right to divorce for the first time. So they have like suddenly half the population, the women, are in support of the new government. They had to stabilize the currency. They did land reform, taxation, ended prostitution, fought against the plague, against disease. And at the same time, just 1 year later, they entered a war against the US in Korea in order to prevent the US from attacking China again via Korea with the help of the nationalist government, which still sits in Taiwan. And knowing the history, the Japanese also came through Korea into China. So the Chinese were really afraid that the enemy at the gates would be a big threat. And they did all of this at the same time. And how this is emotionally even possible in a situation of such poverty, I think, is just by the euphoria of the victory. And that's something that a country can use when you win a surprising victory or a fascinating victory against a very superior enemy. And then finally, victory is here in whatever form, to use this momentum to really drive through hard changes that are necessary, that maybe the government knows is necessary, but is right now not able to carry out. Use the right moment to do that. And I'm not saying which one, because I don't know. I don't want to say it's the same ones for Iran as it was for China. Here, again, this message, Mao rebuilt China. The foundation is really by Mao Zedong, and we see in the middle this period from 1949 to 76 how life experience almost doubled, even though, as I showed before, at this time 90% of Chinese were still considered extremely poor, but they were poor but not hungry anymore. So the focus first on shelter and food, and then on the industry and getting rich and wealthy. To have the priorities clear, that's the main message. To be clear what's the first priority at any point. Deng Xiaoping is very famous in the West especially, and also in China. he changed the focus now away from survival and fighting mode and said, now it's time to get rich, and specifically let some people get rich first so they can then take the others along with them, and then we achieve common prosperity. He did allow for market in China, but I think it's very important to keep in mind Deng Xiaoping did not allow for capitalism in the sense that capital takes control over politics. For example, until today in China, the banks are state-owned, and the majority of the overall capital in Chinese companies is state-owned companies or state-owned banks that own it. And within that framework of a state-owned planned economy, there is a market economy. So in the economic model, the government keeps a leading role, and I get to the leading role in a second. In 2012, Xi Jinping comes to power, and again, changes this main contradiction, this idea, what's the main focus that the Communist Party should have in leading China? He says, okay, we are not poor anymore, so getting rich is not the main focus anymore. We have to now focus on things like uneven development. Some are rich, some are poor. We get rich, but the nature gets destroyed. We have pollution, etc. And the people don't just want more things. They want actually a comprehensive, better life, a more beautiful China, a more healthy China, and a strong China also. And basically, in the sense that Deng Xiaoping said, let some get rich first, so they take the others along. Xi Jinping says, okay, now some have really gotten very, very rich. It's now time for them to take the others along and do things that develop, for example, Western China, develop the more poor regions. And what I think here are very valuable takeaways is that China could change direction without denouncing the old. Maybe people know Deng Xiaoping famously said about Mao Zedong, he did 70% correct and 30% wrong. So he didn't say Mao was horrible. He said there are some mistakes made, but overall he helped this country, he built this country. And now Deng Xiaoping didn't even mention, Xi Jinping doesn't even mention Deng Xiaoping. He changes direction again, but he doesn't say like who was better, was it more Mao, was it more Deng Xiaoping? He just says now the situation is different from where it was before. So now we have a new focus. And to have this focus is really important so that the limited resources can be used effectively. And that's now today the model of Chinese economic development. It's like an up and down. So on the upper layer, I put here the state, the Communist Party, top-down leadership, which is very well known and famous. But at the same time, there's a very strong bottom-up mechanism as well. So for example, scientists, entrepreneurs, companies, they always venture into new directions internationally as well, foreign capital entering China, looking for new markets, new business models. And the government, the Communist Party, they have think tanks to really analyze what's happening, what's working, what is a potential future industry that can become important. And at one point they say, okay, this industry is important, is going to be very relevant. And they announce this publicly. And by publicly announcing it, it creates a big run for capital, for local governments, for everyone, for startups to say, I want to be in this industry. I want to join this industry. For example, recently, low altitude economy, or 10 years ago, the electric vehicles. The government said, this is the strategy for the future. And it aligns investors, local governments with the special economic zones and startups to do the same thing and work together. That way, it reduces the uncertainty for investors. And it is again based on a very rational analysis, which industry have the potential to come to age now and become important now. And with that analysis, then go into the all-out effort to really build it up and don't do everything at the same time. This already in Deng Xiaoping's period, they never opened up the whole economy at once. I think that's very important. They kept important parts like the infrastructure on state-owned, fixed in own hands to be sure to always have control over the overall economy, and then opened up individual industries. At first, the simple light industry like the textile industry, to make sure there were enough Chinese capable of learning these industries, and then building their own companies. And only after that happened, they open up the next level, the next set of industries to then allow new entrepreneurs to learn from foreign companies. I don't go into the details. This is what is now the focus of China. Just again, the three main messages I really want to drive home is the reconstruction starts before the war ends, with the focus on livelihood, on rebuilding infrastructure, and also in moving fast break things. Sometimes you don't have time to analyze everything in these harsh times. But then when you open up, do it step by step with full control to not have like a downfall like the Soviet shock therapy that really destroyed a lot of human lives and the human capital and capital as a whole. And then never stop reforming and always fight corruption. That's, I think, another very important lesson from China that's valid for the whole world, to really fight against those who exploit the system for their personal benefits.
Thank you so much, Harold. I
Yeah, sure.
really appreciate it.
If you have more questions, feel free to delve into anything.
Sure. Yeah, I would like to ask the audience if they can write down their questions in the chat box. I'm going to ask them at the end of the session. So, Jeff, I finally found your presentation. So please go ahead, Jeff. I share your presentation on the screen. So you can go ahead.
Okay, fine. Thank you. This is, go back.
Okay.
Go back. This is a presentation which you can see the full presentation is detailed on the bottom line. And it's a the document on the bottom line is produced jointly by myself and Mohsen Abduluzia, who's Mohsen. I don't know if I got your pronunciation of your surname right. It's always difficult. And you can see details about my life to some degree and Mohsen's. Can we have the next slide, please?
Sure.
Look, Iran is running supposedly a sort of a resistance economy in the face of international sanctions and hostility. And it's a bit like Russia now. After the 1990s, the messy 1990s, but before, Russia now is running sort of a resistance economy in the face of international hostility and sanctions. But after the messy 1990s and before the annexation of Crimea, Russia was quite open, and it learned a lot from foreign experts and the import of, including management experts, and the import of foreign technologies. So if Iran continues to stick to a resistance economy, it's going to find that its living standards will fall relative to other countries. And I'm going to repeat this issue a bit later, but Mao Zedong supposedly said that power comes from the barrel of a gun. And I think Iranian leadership should recognize that the efficiency and the power of that gun depends on the economic system and the economic technologies that you can employ. Unless Iran opens up more with a more moderate government, it's going to find that its resistance economy is become weaker and weaker relative to the rest of the world. Could I have the next slide, please? Basically thinking this thing. Now, I've worked as an economist, as I said, a chief economist of a bank in Australia. I had extensive 12 years on and off experience in Russia, and I've worked in China, in Shanghai, on financial markets reform. And I think when I started to look at detail and what Iran has in terms of economic infrastructure, I realized that a lot of the basic conditions are there, at least in theory, for rapid economic growth if the government would accept more moderate policies and be open to foreigners, good relations, and foreign investment. And as I said in this last line here, in terms of soft power or military power, particularly military power, unless Iran is prepared to develop its economy, its military power will just be no more than pot shots across the water into the Hormuz Strait. Can I now see the next slide, please? Now, I think there are two questions that Iran faces. One is, do you want to become a mini China 2025 or MIC 2025? Become a major producer and exporter of industrial technology products? Or do you recognize that as a major producer of natural resources, gas, oil, that you are better off focusing on a user of imported technologies from countries like China? And Australia has become is a resource-cursed country like Iran, and has become a very good, powerful country, economically powerful country because of that. Russia was on the way to doing that in the early 2000s, in the early years of the Putin and Dmitry Medvedev presidencies, but then it squandered it when it decided to have terrible relations with its neighbours after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and particularly the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Now, an important concept here is terms of trade. If Iran is exporting $100 million barrels of oil, it can get a certain amount of money. But with the modern, quickly advancing technology, you can keep exporting that same amount of oil, presumably at the same price each year, but you can import increasingly amount of computing power because the prices and the advances or the prices of technology are falling as the technology is completely or totally progressing to a higher level. So the terms of trade. Now, that doesn't mean that Iran will always have a good terms of trade, that the present terms of trade will always remain constant. And if the oil prices fell and technology prices did not fall, then Iran's terms of trade could deteriorate. But Australia has done very well by sticking mainly to natural resource exports and importing technology. And that has made Australia a wealthy country. So Iran needs to consider whether it wants to go that path, a sensible Australian path, or the Chinese path. Can I have the next slide, please?
Sure.
Now, irrespective of which path Iran chooses, it needs to have a better governmental system, a more transparent budgetary system, a legal system, a financial system. And as I've said, I think in theory at least, most of the systems in place, even including competition laws, budgetary laws, research organizations, good education system, are in place. It needs to have better relations with other countries, better relations internally between different sectors of society and the economy, and also, where possible, to get people who've left Iran to return. The Iranian drain brain has been quite huge. And I know from people that I've worked with from Iran, I work with in Russia, that there are many talented people who would like to return to better their country. But the present political system and the international attitudes to Iran and Iran's international attitudes to the world make that very difficult for them. So I think there's a lot of hope if we can get past these present difficulties between America in particular and Israel, and in the general region, Iran can have a very, very bright future. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I really appreciate it. It was comprehensive. Thank you. So let me talk about the economic consequences of war and priorities that should guide Iran's reconstruction in the months ahead in the post-war phase. So, Michael, if you can hear me, I would like to ask this question from you. You've mentioned earlier in your presentation about like the post-war economic context and reconstruction priorities, but I would like to raise this question that what general principles should guide the reconstruction priorities, and basically which sectors are usually addressed first and why?
Perfect. So there's quite a few sectors that are going to be key to effectively making sure this all works. But there's also some pretty big decisions to make. Now, some of them obviously the government can make themselves. As Jeff said, it is better if this government is reaching out and doing more with other states. There are a lot of decisions that will also have to come from outside. So a massive part of the sort of hampering of the Iranian economy has come from the fact that the government's effectively been under sanctions now since 1979. And that really hampers their ability to import in technology or import in other abilities that usually would be economic drivers. At the very, very early stages, as I talked about a bit earlier on, yes, getting your ironworks, getting your communication, getting your ports back up and running is obviously going to be the big calls to make. But additionally, there has to be big decisions about, things like whether you regionalize or centralize the government. We're doing a lot of comparisons here with China, but China is a fairly actually quite centralized government. If let's say we go with an IRGC, a much more IRGC-led government, let's just put it that way, that's likely to see a less centralized government, a government that is more devolved to the regions. Now, you can argue that has some advantages, but as you can see from the Indian system, that usually has a lot of quirks with it as well and makes national infrastructure planning a little more difficult. So that's a decision that we need to make pretty soon. It's also narrow versus broad economy. This is, a problem that any resource state is going to have, that, right now when everything even comes back on some sort of online, there will be a decision of, okay, where do we put the money we have? And some people will say, look, for every dollar we put into the oil industry, we get 6 or 7 back. That's where we should be putting our money. But it just cannibalizes other industries, So there will be a lot of people making that decision of, should we be effectively pulling our money and going into less productive industries, that are better for the overall economy. Classic example would be, should we be importing copper wire in from China, which is probably going to be at 28, maybe even 35% cheaper, or build up a copper industry or build up a copper production industry inside Iran, which employs more people, and we build it domestically in case that sanctions ever come back. And that's, again, a big decision that needs to be made. Again, the concentrating of power is also a big one. Again, if I'm doing business in a country like Australia, or I'm doing business in a country like Liberia, with power, you have to be able to guarantee that everything will work. The courts aren't too concentrated, that you can't have a president just on a whim make a decision. And this will be a big decision. The IRGC hasn't been nearly as powerful as they will probably become after this, and how much the power they have could end up centralizing that and making it a much less predictable government. And again, when it comes to any of these long-term investments we talked about with the kind of shovels and tractors principles, you always want predictability over anything else. Again, that self-reliance was a competitive advantage. Right now, Iran has had to live in a world where they have been under sanctions since 1979, which means they built a lot of self-reliance in the economy. Most of the gas goes into powering stuff domestically. A massive amount of the production in the current country, particularly when it comes to things like automobiles, are designed, manufactured, and produced with the domestic market in mind. That is a great way to keep an economy functioning whilst you're under this cloud of sanctions and this outwardly imposed problems. But if they want to really develop the economy, that will mean finding a way that isn't the case anymore. But if you take all the sanctions off tomorrow, do you start to move to a very reliant economy? So when sanctions get slapped back on, it'll hurt twice as bad. And that's a big decision that will need to be made. And the last one, I guess, is deterrence versus disarmament. Okay, I can hand back to you.
No, go ahead, please.
The last one is, again, it was deterrence versus disarmament. I think Ukraine came up as a bit of an example earlier on, and I think that's a really good example. Iran right now has this kind of an interesting conundrum, like Ukraine in 1991, where people look, it was a bit chaotic in the 1990s, things stabilized in the late 90s, coming into the 2000s. But, people might have felt confident at that point because, Russia and Ukraine were, working together, and that's fine. But then when Russia starts to kind of impose itself, well, now I don't feel much, I don't know if I can put a 20-year investment anymore. And that becomes even more problematic after 2014 and 2022. With Iran, there will be a decision of, should we be putting money into the military after this, particularly rebuilding some of the, bits that have been destroyed in these last rounds of combat, because some will say, look, this is an unproductive sector of the economy, we shouldn't be doing this. Or others are saying, look, if we don't build up a deterrence, then this is only going to happen again in 3 years' time when another American election happens or something of that variety. And that's a real conundrum that you need to effectively decide what your defensive posture is. And for the Iranians, that could even be whether they go back to the forward defense doctrines of sort of keeping the battles in Syria and Iraq and Yemen rather than on their home shore, or whether they double down on this successful strategy of making themselves quite difficult to invade and able to sort of porcupine strategy their way out of this. Disarming will get them better relations and will get them, better press, and probably will up the chance that sanctions will be taken off. But it means that they're opening themselves up to having all of this done to them again. And if I'm Iran, I do understand why they do have distrust of the Western powers at this point, after the government had largely complied with the JCPOA.
Thank you so much, Michael. The scene is very complicated and fragile at the same time, so it depends on many factors. And we'll see how it ends. So let me get back to you, Lucy, if you can hear me. Let me bring back my webcam. Okay, Lucy. So reconstruction is not only about rebuilding what has already been lost. It can also serve as an opportunity to reshape the economy and lay the foundation for long-term industrial transformation. So I want to raise this question from you, Lucy. What opportunities does reconstruction present for industrial upgrading that might not exist in normal circumstances? Sorry, we can't hear you. I feel like you're muted.
Hi. I'm
Hi.
Sam. Hello.
Yes, you're audible. Go
Hope-
ahead, please.
Cool. So I would put it that way. Because the opportunity is not the crisis itself. The opportunity is that reconstruction forces a country to make choices that in normal time are very difficult to make, right? So in normal circumstances, industrial upgrading is slow. Like if you understand it from like physics perspective, a factory will keeps using equipment because it's their functioning. A city will keeps relying on unreliable grade because replacing it is expensive. So reconstructions changes this. It creates a moment when infrastructure, equipment, standards all have to be reconsidered at the same time. So the first opportunity, therefore, I think, is to avoid like rebuilding yesterday's economy. For Iran, this matters particularly in sectors where the old model already had some visible like disadvantages, like electricity reliability, some water stress, logistic, and access to markets. So like rebuilding power and water and so on, and like such as digital systems also should not be treated as separate engineering projects. They should be treated as an operating system for this whole industrial recovery. And I believe that a road is not only a road, it determines whether a producer can reach a port or a regional market. So, like a stable power supply is not only a public service, it determines whether a manufacturer can fulfill an order. And also, water management is not only an environmental issue, it determines which industry can realistically grow in which places. So, the second opportunity, I think, is to turn reconstruction demand into industrial learning, as reconstruction will create a lot of demands, like for example, cement, steel engineer, housing maintenance, and digital services. So the key question is, will this demand simply generate contracts, or will it create some some stronger and long-term owning, like local firm. So as also as a founder, we sometimes I look at things in a very practical way. Like when the major projects end, what remains? Do local companies know more than before? Are young engineers better trained? Are SMEs now qualified to supply bigger projects? Can a local company maintain the equipment after the foreign contractor leaves? So if the answer is no, then reconstruction may look impressive, but it has not created industry upgrading. So this is why procurement also makes so much. Large contracts can include requirements for local supplier participation, workforce training, technology partnerships, and transparent performance standards. This is not about clothing the economy or insisting on unrealistic self-sufficient. It is about ensuring that money spent on reconstruction leaves behind capabilities inside the country. And the third opportunity is to make resilience a source of competitiveness. Because, in the Middle East, resilience is not an abstract policy word, it's commercial reality. Especially in Chinese social media, they always poetry Middle Eastern as a very dangerous place. But in fact, I don't think so. Businesses care about whether, like, water is available, whether power is stable, whether supply chain can survive, the disruption. So I think that if I have to say, like, Iran can use reconstruction to build an economy that is less vulnerable to these shocks, more efficient energy use, better water system, a stronger long maintenance like networks, and more diverse strategy, trade and logistic links. So I believe that reconstruction should not be measured by how much concrete is poured. It should be measured by whether, like 5 years later, Iran has more capable firms, more skilled people, and fewer structure bottlenecks than before. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. I appreciate it. And okay, we have talked about the Chinese experience, which we have heard Harald's presentation, which offered valuable insights into how industrial capacity can be restored after major disruptions, lessons from China. So,
Um, can I just make a comment on what Lucy just said?
sure, sure, Jeff, please go ahead.
Look, I agree totally with her about the need for basic infrastructure, transport, electricity, and water, etc. But also, it's important that the Iranian government avoid sort of big projects which appeal to the international audience or even domestically because they look good in a PR sense. And I think, for example, in Saudi Arabia, the neon project of some massive building project crossing the Saudi Arabian desert. It's the sort of stuff that just needs to be avoided. And too often, governments in a situation like Iran might be, some people get carried away, they have power, and they think that they can produce some massive project which makes them and the country look good, but really which do not give many returns and turn out to be white elephants. White elephants is a term which something is big but doesn't produce much at all?
Thank you so much, Jeff. So let's talk about industrial policy, the role of industrial policy in post-war economic recovery. So I would like to raise this question from you, Michael. Which industrial policy instruments, such as targeted subsidies, tax incentives, or public procurement, or even special economic free zones, are likely to be most effective during the reconstructional phase of the post-war?
Again, I think this is a complicated question, and it will be a case by case and a case by case basis, effectively. If again, I would only my big suggestion would always be just to look at productive projects. Like I was talking about, building a railroad down to Chabahar would probably net some money back, and it would be a good thing for the economy. But again, this would be a case by case basis. I think finance.
So in the case of sorry, your volume is not as strong. I can hear it.
Sorry about that. Is that
yes, it's better now. In the case of Iran, in this post-war, if it is assumed as post-war, in this case, which are those industrial policy instruments are seem to be more effective?
Again, I think big infrastructure projects have always been what got China through, particularly earthquake reconstruction projects, natural disasters, as well as coming out of the 2008 recession. But that is going to be counterintuitive, because obviously you're spending money at the worst time for the economy. Again, a big part of this will also be getting the financial instruments ready to do this. Right now, if I'm an investor and I want to invest in Iran, it is going to be quite difficult for me to do so, and risky. Getting a lot of finances up and running and making sure those finances are somewhat independent will also kind of almost be the very first thing you need to get going. Right after you get phones, communication, water, just the basics going, and making some sort of policy where you can get people the best contractor to do the job. And this is a kind of always a concern when it comes to Iran, with the corruption index being 23 out of 150 if memory serves. It's kind of below bottom third, which means that investors also know corruption is going to be a major factor in these decisions. So yeah, there's lots of projects that can be, but right in the first, getting just back to just a functioning day-to-day government, and then from there starting to get finance up and running, trying to fix some corruption issues, and going into projects that at least kick off an economic development or fixing bottlenecks that currently exist in the economy, like there being no rail line down to Chabahar.
Yes, thank you so much. So I would like to come back to you, Harald, if you can hear me. I would like to raise the next question from you. How should Iran identify and prioritize strategic industries that can drive both post-war recovery and long-term economic competitiveness, in your opinion?
Oh, yes, this is really the core question right now. I think this is one of the most important points. And I think Michael presented a really cool framework that's very helpful about various categories that need to be looked at, like self-reliance versus comparative advantage, or deterrence versus disarmament, how much focus on military, how much rely on a peace dividend. And the core focus definitely is to start with where the industry is at. So you cannot just say, this is a cool industry, let's do this one. But you need to have a basis on which you can build. And you have a lot of experts in Iran on supply chain, on value chains, where you can analyze what is Iran currently good at and where can that expand into. And I think this is the method how to get there, to analyze which industries are now at a point that can be developed in terms of like an advanced industry, while at the same time, as just mentioned, Michael, as well, also rebuild the basic infrastructure. And I think one thing that I really want to mention, and maybe also push back a little bit on this notion of Iran decentralized versus China centralized. I think what Iran really can look at in China's development model is the interplay between local and central, where a center can give a direction and say, okay, this is where we want to go, and then start like a competition between different industrial areas, where the local governments then should each find a different method, a different way to develop an industry, and then see which way is the best one. So have central strategy, but at the same time, local implementation and local experiments. Because if the whole country only does it one way, that kind of central command economy has not worked well, because nobody can really predict what works. So you always need this element of experiment. But if you have a completely free market where there's no direction, Iran is not that big a country. You need to focus the resources, especially now you don't have too many resources available. So you really want to focus on 2-3 core industries that you say we have the basic capabilities and the resources, we can import what we need to develop it, and then let different regions compete against each other to have this experimental environment where different ways are tried and different startups get a chance to compete, and then we'll see which one works best. So it's not a concrete example what you should do, but a method how you can get to successful upgrading of the industry.
Thank you so much, Harold. So successful reconstruction. Okay,
Harold, can I
sure,
just
Jeff.
ask a question here? When I lived in Shanghai, I spent a lot of time looking at reform of the Chinese financial sector, particularly as Shanghai has a particular ambition to become an international financial center. And I understand this idea of special economic zones and interregional competition in China, because, as you've eloquently described, the historical Chinese situation. But I'm not too sure that it applies or should apply in Iran, because it's a smaller country, and it has a more of a history, more recent history of being capability with, in theory at least, institutional framework. So I think this interregional competition issue is probably less important than in Iran than in China, and would be less effective.
In my view, definitely. I mean, Iran can never have the scale of China. That's obvious. Nonetheless, what my point was is the interplay between local and central, to have a strategic centralism, but a local tactical implementation, rather than just like digital, either it's centralized or it's regional. I think modern governance can really combine the strengths of both, to have local governments develop what they're best at, but with a national strategy, so that the regions then are complementary and not going in completely different directions.
Thank you so much, Harold. So I'm asking the last question of the panel from you, Michael, since we run out of time. So, Michael, how do you think about this discussion? What governance reforms, like as Jeff mentioned, might be necessary to strengthen Iran's capacity to manage this reconstruction effectively?
Mostly just building up institutions. That's the key for almost anything. You know, when you look at why a country succeeds and why it doesn't, it's almost always institutions, and it's the trust that other people have in those institutions. I'm going to bring it back to Central Asia because that's what I focus on today. But Kazakhstan has like a fourth of the population of the region, has 54% of the entire GDP, and one of the major things that kicked off their entire system, effectively allowing British courts to arbitrate decisions if things were to get to that stage in mining or investment disputes. So people trust that the Kazakh system is, hey, I can put my money in and I can think long term about how I do things. Iran needs to make sure it gets to that point where an investor is comfortable going in, and that's a very difficult road to do, though. Again, as I kind of talked about really earlier in the presentation, whether it be when the JCPOA was put on, Iran opened their doors. They did really well with that opportunity. You know, they built up these great industries. They were working really well with the EU in particular, and it was looking like the beginning of something really great, particularly as the fact that at that point in time, over 50% of the country was under the age of 30, and most of them are very, very well educated. This was seeming to be effectively the beginning of something great, and then through almost no fault of their own, it was all taken away. And that's a really difficult problem to solve because it's not one that Iran can solve unilaterally. Like this peace deal or this conflict, again, this is something that will need to be solved both in Washington, in Tel Aviv, and also in Tehran. And that's a really difficult position for the government to be in, but one that I do hope it can be done, because again, I think Iran has all of the things it needs to be great, if it can sort of wrangle itself together, fix some institutions, and get other countries on board.
Thank you so much, Michael. Staying informed about this kind of developments will be crucial for navigating the evolving landscape of the ongoing crisis in the Middle East. So make sure to stay tuned for our future panels as we dive deep into the new aspects of this ongoing war. Thank you so much to our panelists, Lucy, Jeff, Harold, and Michael, for your insightful contributions. I really appreciate it. And we're looking forward to keeping the dialogue. That's all for today. Thank you so much. Stay connected and goodbye.
Thank you too. Really well done. Thanks for organizing.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.